So let me say a few quick words about Doug. He is an adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, founded the Harvard Kennedy School Broadmoor Project, a collaborative redevelopment effort between the Katrina-devastated Broadmoor New Orleans neighborhood and the Kennedy School. He's been a fellow at the Preventative Defense Project at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, where he worked on a plan for San Francisco in preparing to recover faster after a disaster strikes. And in San Francisco, we all know that's most likely an earthquake. A senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and a fellow at the Shorenstein Center for Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard, Ahlers teaches courses on the management of disaster recovery, which blend case teaching, for which Harvard is very famous, with field research. He teaches courses such as community recovery, rebuilding disaster-damaged communities in Chile, disaster recovery management and urban development, rebuilding cities after a disaster. He is the co-founder of Modem Media and is on the Smithsonian Institution's National Board and the board of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, among many other things that it would take me an hour to describe in terms of the things that Doug does. He has a wide range of expertise, everything from traveling around the world to monitor elections in highly contested areas, as well as another history, which I won't go into now, other than to say many years ago, he was, I can't say my student, he was a person learning next to me. And often I learned from him. So, Doug.
Great. Thank you, Judith, for that introduction. I am obviously an alum of URI and had some wonderful years here and learned at the hand of Judith Swift, and I thank you for those years of tutelage and your mentorship ever since. As Judith mentioned, I teach, I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School, and my area is crisis management. Very specifically, I actually focus on disaster recovery, rebuilding of communities after a disaster, and all of the issues that surround the restoration, recovery, and reconstruction of communities, as well as I focus on the beginning prior to a disaster on the areas of mitigation and what we call advanced recovery, which is preparing in advance to recover of a disaster, to recover faster after a disaster. As such, I not only teach on the areas, but I do a lot of research in these areas, as well as do a lot of on-the-ground work in disaster zones around the world, as well as in cities and communities that have a high risk of a potential future disaster, to help them with resiliency. And that is the topic for tonight's conversation. So to talk a little bit about resiliency, which is sort of the new hot buzzword, although we've actually been working on this issue for a while, we have to sort of start of thinking of communities as systems, of a set of interdependent systems, social, economic, natural systems, the environment and the built environment, that are obviously interlocked systems, and then shocks to the system, either sometimes internal shocks, or most often the ones that we look at are external shocks to the system. And these can be slow-moving or very rapid, an earthquake being very rapid, or a hurricane, or slow-moving, such as climate change shocks to the system. All good talks on resilience begin with a definition. This is the one that I like to use for resilience. That it is resilience determines the persistence of the relationships within a system, and is a measure of the ability of the system to absorb the changes and still persist, the operative word, still persist as a functioning system after a disaster. The best way to think of resilience is actually to think of it in layers, so prevention, mitigation, recovery, and adaptation. Prevention being avoiding system shocks altogether, mitigation being able to withstand and absorb shocks, recovery being able to rebound from the shocks, and adaptation or adaptation is to be able to adjust to the new situation. I should actually do a little point of terminology here, because in the climate change world, basically mitigation is roughly equivalent to prevention in the disaster management world, and adaptation is roughly equivalent to mitigation. I come from doing disaster research and disaster management and emergency management on the policy side, so these are the ones I will do. You'll have to do the translation to the sort of climate change world. But if you actually think of these in terms of layers of resiliency, they can be either not resilient at all or fully resilient, and think of it sort of as each layer being sort of somewhere on a scale between those. So we use I use the Swiss cheese model, which is the James Reason model, which is basically, if you think of these each as a slice of Swiss cheese, basically for a disaster to make it through and create losses at the end, it's basically all the holes have to line up. And of course you can have some very wholly slices of Swiss cheese or very solid ones. And this is a great way to sort of frame our thinking about sort of layers of resiliency. When it comes to actually, in the rest of the talk, I'm actually going to start showing examples of the ways that we can actually be resilient, create resiliency in the environment. And there are some sort of key strategies for resiliency. Retreat, basically land use policy, hardening to withstand shocks, flexibility or pliable design, being able to come up with designs and strategies so that we can actually absorb or sort of bend with the shocks to the system, the perturbations. Redundancy, the concept of basically being able to have acceptable losses. Recoverability, the ability to bounce back sooner. Community capacity, which is basically capital, whether it be social capital, physical capital, human capital, and the ability to build capacity. And then, of course, transference of risk, which really does not often this is either through insurance or through some form of externality where we pass the risk on to future generations or to remote people in remote areas from ourselves. It actually does not reduce or really limit the risk. It just moves it off to some other system. I'm actually going to talk about the first three, which are really more sort of mostly to do with the built environment. And ways that we can actually create physical resiliency. The other ones we spend a lot of time in. I spend actually a lot of time in these three, but that's a talk for another occasion. So the first thing I want to talk about is retreat and land use policy, and ways that over as sea level rises and we become more vulnerable, there are going to be occasions, several occasions, where we are actually going to have to retreat from places as part of our mitigation strategy. This is an example of, this is Christchurch, New Zealand, and this is sort of mud and water in the streets of the eastern suburbs. It is from liquefaction due to a February 22nd earthquake. And for those of you not familiar with liquefaction, basically it's in the process of shaking water that's at or below the water table level, basically turns into liquid. It takes on liquid properties, becomes very unstable. And one of the things that happens is anytime there's a fissure or rupture, basically the sort of liquefied soil under pressure sort of gushes out in what are called sand boils or eruptions, and indeed fills the street with and flooded the homes with basically muck. With liquefaction, things that like to float, swimming pools and things like that, sewer manholes, pop up out of the ground. They basically literally float up out of the ground. And things that are heavy, like cars, tend to sink into the ground, telephone poles, and indeed houses. The red line here is the level line. And this is not shake damage from structural damage from shaking. This is literally the house sinking into the ground like that car did due to liquefaction. This is an example of the house uniformly settling into the ground, sinking into the soil. And this is the central city is this piece here, and the rest is the suburbs and then the coast to the ocean of Christchurch. This is the area of liquefaction for the city of Christchurch. It's in a valley where several rivers come out of the southern Alps, and it's very fine silt soil as it comes to the as a deltaic plain. Which is very fine silt soils, as well as high water level tables, are the perfect thing for liquefaction to occur. This is a map of the ground movement. The yellow is horizontal movement. The land literally shifts horizontally. The red and the green are vertical movements. The red is soil ground that has sunk since the earthquake. It's anywhere between 0.5 meter to 1.5 meters in sinking. And the green is actually land that has been lifted up, that has come up from the earthquake. This is a LiDAR map of the same area. The red is where you have the most sinking, and the blue is where you have the most soil rising. And this is a map of the damage of each of the damaged properties of here, and you can see it actually corresponds quite well to the areas of the heaviest sinking of soil, settling of the soil. And if you'll notice, this is actually the Avon River as it snakes through the community, snakes through the central business district and out to the eastern suburbs. And one of the things that we find is that's where anywhere obviously near a water body is where you're going to tend to have much more liquefaction. And it also is the cause of another source of damage from earthquakes, which is lateral spreading, which is basically where the soil is near or adjacent to a water body just sort of gives way and falls off into the water body, creating the sort of cracks in the soil that we often see with earthquakes. And this is a map of the lateral spreading, and it actually, you can see, is also very close to the Avon rivers and some of the tributaries to the Avon River, and maps very closely to the damage as well. So there are many things that we can do about it. The first is we can do retreat from those areas and not rebuild, basically pull back from the areas that have a high liquefaction. And most cities, for example, I don't have a picture of it here, but San Francisco, for example, we know exactly where the liquefaction areas are. There's liquefaction maps for most cities. We can actually do soil remediation through several processes. It's expensive. And then rebuild on top of that. We can basically stabilize the soil. We can do sort of a combination where we do piles and then for stability, and then remediate the soil as it gets close to the edge of the water body. Or we can do some sort of combination where we do a partial retreat and partial piles. There are actually many solutions that we can do to how one actually deals with unstable soils. And this is what the government of New Zealand chose to do. All of those remediation things were expensive, so they chose the first option, which is basically retreat from the water bodies. So this is the red zone in the eastern suburbs. And these are the areas that have been deemed by the central government, by the national government of New Zealand, that homeowners are no longer able to live in these areas. Homes will not be rebuilt in these areas, and the national government is buying out the homeowners. It amounts to about 6,500 properties that they are moving out of the liquefied areas. It's not just limited to residential properties. This is the Grand Chancellor Hotel in the Central Business District, and that is not an optical illusion. The building literally settled one side of the building into the ground. So the central city plan for, which has the river going right through it, is to actually pull back from the river. The red area is the central city before the disaster, and the plan is, on the bottom, is to have a much more shrunken footprint for the city, pulling back away from the river, and even in that area, all of the buildings that will be rebuilt will have to be on piles. Many were not on piles previously. And as part of the design, in terms of urban design, one of the key concepts is to try and create, to basically recapture and use that as green space, and take something that one has to do for safety reasons and turn it into an amenity for the city. So this is Dichato in Chile. This is another community that we work with. We're very much involved in helping this city rebuild. In February 27th of 2010, there was an 8.8 magnitude earthquake and tsunami, a small tsunami, but not so small if you lived in Dichato, where about 50 people perished. From the seventh wave of the tsunami, they actually had gone back into the village, having thought it was over. This is Dichato before the tsunami, and this is Dichato after it was scoured by the tsunami wave. This is what it looked like before. It was a sort of beach community, and this is what it looked like after the tsunami. So this is the master plan for Dichato. This sort of reddish, brickish color is the area that they are retreating from and not allowing to be rebuilt on, the red zone. The sort of orange zone is they are allowing things to be rebuilt in that zone, but they have to actually be to a much higher design standard. And this is basically the sort of three zones: the red zone, the orange zone, and the yellow zone. This sort of line is the coast in terms of elevation. And red zone is not there, although a few commercial things, especially related to, for example, a fueling station for boats for the marina, et cetera, can be in the red zone. Orange zone with special building codes, and then anyone in the yellow zone. This is a look at building type. So wood frame masonry and reinforced concrete, and then tsunami depth going across, and then the level of damage for each. And it basically can sort of the rule of thumb as to the how building types perform in tsunamis based on the height of the tsunami. It's not the only factor. There are other factors in this as well, but it's a fairly good rule of thumb, and it is used to guide a lot of the building codes for and is actually being used to guide the building codes for Chile in Dichato, plus many other 25 coastal communities that all had tsunami damage as well. So one other way to deal with mitigation is to, we talked about land use. The other is to actually do systems that harden, and one is through land engineering. And so this is the risk studies for Dichato as well. and they basically are looking at doing tsunami mitigation tactics, and so the series of diagrams on the left is from without mitigation and then with mitigation. You'll see mitigation has some effect. It's not a panacea. As we find out, very few mitigation techniques are panaceas. Really, it's the layering of things that work. This is another community in Chile, Constitucion, a little north of Dichato, which also had tsunami damage. Here, I've forgotten the exact figure, but it was around 70, 80 people died from the tsunami there. This is Constitucion before, and this is after. And very similarly, the red zone is areas that will not be rebuilt, where land use is being used as a form of mitigation in terms of retreat. The green zone, though, is tsunami mitigation things, very specifically a tsunami park, often or a tsunami forest. It's also coupled with evacuation routes which is another form of mitigation, both mitigation routes, evacuation routes, as well as vertical evacuation things. But I'm going to concentrate a little bit on the tsunami forest, the tsunami mitigation park. And if you can notice that it sort of is in little bumps, basically speed bumps. And if you sort of see the A, B, C, D across, they're actually varying in height. So you get larger in terms of height the further in as part of the design of the thing. This is not just some little whim kind of thing. A lot of work goes into around the world into how to do tsunami mitigation measures. And this is actually a thing for coastal forests if you look at the tsunami height on the x-axis, and then the forest width, and basically what you need in terms of things. So this is Constitucion, and then the park on the tsunami mitigation park, and these are photos before, what it looks like now after it's been scoured, and what the park will look like. So the concept is basically that you can use mitigation as, again, an amenity, both for protecting safety, but also making it a nice place. This is another example. It doesn't, the concept is you can still have usable waterfront. They need it for fishing as well as they want for recreation, and coming up with ways to actually still have usable waterfront, but also make it safer. And those are more shots of what the park actually looks like. Moving to New Orleans, also, which is sort of famous for trying to use hardening as a method to protect itself. These are the elevations of New Orleans. Obviously, the blue is the lowest and is well below sea level. This is the flooding from Katrina, and this is the southeastern Louisiana. This map goes from 1939 to 2050, and is the red indicates the projected coastal loss in that time. It's basically about 34 square miles a year are lost in coast. That comes from a lot of reasons. one is that we've stopped basically rebuilding the delta by constraining the Mississippi River. We're not creating new lands the way that would normally happen, and that the channel for the Mississippi River has been dredged out so that all of the silt coming out of the Mississippi River goes way off into the Gulf of Mexico and drops too far out to ever be able to build land. It's also a function of literally thousands of canals that have been dug for navigation and pipelines for the oil industry that have then that have cut up the wetlands and then also allowed saltwater intrusion into the area. And then, of course, storms that bring storm surge into the areas do a lot of damage to the already weakened environment. But there are ways to actually do restoration of New Orleans. So the first thing is to sort of start with a barrier island and salt marsh. Often the barrier islands may be improving what exists and strengthening them, because we're losing them quite rapidly, which is also part of the problem, but also building new barrier islands, followed by a brackish marsh, a marsh land bridge, natural ridge, building up the natural ridges that exist, using highways through as barriers, and then the actual levee, and then elevated buildings, etc., and then evacuation routes. This is actually a great example of the layered approach that I was talking about before. This is a very confusing diagram of ways to rebuild the coast, a very heavy engineering solution. Of course, we have one of the most incredible land production machines ever invented, or not invented, natural, which is the Mississippi River itself, to be able to create land. The number one, this sort of orange line at the bottom, is the rebuilding of barrier islands. We actually have been building quite a few, especially up sort of where the one is on the right-hand side, the Chandelier Islands. Has been a lot. I don't know if you sort of followed the sand berm thing during the oil spill. Basically, Bobby Jindal, the governor, wanted to build sand berms and got BP to give him lots of money to do that. Obviously, it was not effective for the oil spill and was actually poor science, but actually that money largely has now gone into coastal restoration projects for building some, really truly building some barrier islands. The next area, two, is the sort of brown, is actually using the silt and using diversions from the Mississippi River to build new delta. There's also plans actually to move a lot of that silt over and start using it to build land over here. We actually have done, some of this is, project plans that are still waiting for funding, but we actually do build in the Atchafalaya Basin. We actually have several projects going on now that are about building new land there. And of course, restoration of the wetlands, rebuilding the ridges, and then of course the number 5, the rebuilding of the levee system. And indeed, this is a project in Amsterdam, the Iberg project, which is about building new islands and building land. It is very possible. In this case, they actually have to do it in layers, where they put down a layer and then another layer and another layer and keep building it up over time. And then they have the problem of you cannot just build on, once you've created this island, you cannot build on it. You have to actually compact the soils before it can support the weight of homes. That process usually takes about a decade or a little longer, which is a long time to wait for an island. So they've come up with a a really innovative thing of basically putting tens of thousands of straws into the soil, and then the soil under pressure, water comes up through the soils, and it takes the process down to about 2 years before you can actually start using the land to build on it. And this is a plan for New Orleans, still waiting funding, but to build, this is Lake Pontchartrain, this is which sits to the north of the city. It was the source of a lot of the damage to especially the Gentilly and Lakeview areas and sort of the center part of the city, because the counterclockwise nature of rotation of the storm pushed the water from Lake Pontchartrain down from the north into the city. And one of the ideas is to build barrier islands to help with some of the storm surge there, and of course to also use them for amenity as well, for recreation, etc. And of course barriers are one of the we love barriers as a way of hardening things. This is the new barrier that sits at Lake Bourne, which is sort of the intersection of the Intercoastal Waterway, the Industrial Canal, and the Mr. Go, the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, which was the funnel which took the storm surge right into the lower Ninth Ward and flooded New Orleans. And this sort of curved barrier now, this is actually the backside of the barrier, but is basically a giant storm shield to protect that area, with a few locks in it for vessels to get through. Really expensive thing, and already it's it's designed to a standard project hurricane, which is basically a Category 3 hurricane or a 100-year storm hurricane, and already it's considered to be out of date as being too low, too small. This is the levee system for New Orleans, the flood protection system. Actually, it's now the flood risk reduction system. We're not calling it a flood protection system. Subtle change in language about it. And each of these are the levee reaches, and the yellow numbers are the heights, the mandated heights for the levees for New Orleans as they now stand. The system is just about complete. Since Katrina in construction. And again, each of these numbers are based on the 100-year storm or the 1% annual chance of that storm. Katrina, according to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, was a 1 in 400-year storm. No one actually believes, other than the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, that was true. And this is one of our major problems with using just a hardening approach to our traditional flood control approach, which is that it's generally just a single layer of defense, so is subject to some problems, but also it completely depends on the fact that we've arbitrarily chosen the 1% annual standard for basically what we accept as tolerable risk or acceptable risk, versus many other countries have much higher standards. And I am a huge advocate of the fact that we need to raise our standards. It's not just for levees; it's also where we set our base flood elevations, et cetera, need to be raised to a higher standard of risk, as well as all of these calculations are at present values. They're not forward-looking, so none of them actually say of what the risk will be in 5 years, 10 years, et cetera, even though the life of these projects are 30, 50 years, et cetera. And of course, the problem with any kind of sort of hardening solution, and especially a single layer of defense, is it's only as good as its weakest link. The green, this is pre-Katrina. The green are the areas of the levee that were at the mandated height. The mandated height has not changed since Katrina. It's still of what it was before Katrina. But The yellow was 0 to 2 feet below that level, and the red sections were 2 feet below what they should have been, and even that was not enough. So the other thing that we can do is we can strengthen the building codes themselves on buildings in terms of hardening. This is for the city of San Francisco, has a major project underway to bring up the building codes and do mandatory retrofit of buildings to a new level of performance. And basically, the way to do it is through first to go in and do a vulnerability assessment, especially looking at the importance of a facility by then the construction type to identify your areas of vulnerability and risk. And then to do a gap analysis to look at where you actually want to be in terms of the performance of your building stock. And then the X's, which are sort of the blue squares, the X's are where you actually are today. This is how long it will take you to restore your damaged building stock. And of course, you can see there is actually a huge difference between where the city would want to be and where it actually is in terms of performance. We saw this in Christchurch. The building codes in Christchurch are basically the same as the building codes here, but the building codes in the buildings in the central business district, 60% of the buildings are being demolished and have to be rebuilt. Major economic disruption. Most of those buildings, there were 2 buildings that collapsed. Actually, there were a few more that collapsed, 2 that collapsed and killed people. All the rest of the buildings did what they were supposed to do, which was because our building codes are to a life safety system thing, which is basically that you can get out alive, but the codes are not to a performance standard that says that they actually will be able to be reused after a disaster or reused without repair. Most of the buildings that are actually being demolished in Christchurch are buildings that actually are structurally fine or have some minor structural damage, but the economics of repairing that building make more sense to tear it down and build a new one than try and do the repairs. And that's because our building codes are not set up for buildings to survive an earthquake and be able to be re-inhabited quickly. One of the things, though, is we know, for example, after doing those gap analysis, this is San Francisco, these are the building locations. We actually know where all the buildings are that are actually at very high risk. These are actually of wood frame. We have them for every building type and every thing. So this is wood frame buildings with 3 or more stories and 5 or more residence units. And one of the things that we also know is that retrofit for buildings can have make a real difference in terms of, this is the number of as is that'll be red tagged, collapsed, red tagged, not collapsed, yellow tagged, and green tagged. And then sort of because you can do various levels of retrofit, and those are sort of the various levels and what the building performance would be. We also know we have a lot of great information on how much it actually costs to do retrofits to buildings or to build buildings to a higher standard in new construction. And on average, it comes out around, it depends on the building type and the performance standard, et cetera. But basically around an 8% cost increase, can go a little higher for specialty buildings, et cetera. And that'll give you about 129% increase in the ability to reoccupy that building afterwards. So this is actually the policy for the city of San Francisco, the plan for city of San Francisco to actually require retrofit. So the green is basically trying to use the market to facilitate retrofit in compliance with newer standards. The yellow is sort of nudging, which is requiring evaluation of the building at the sale of the building. trying to use some market forces there. Also creating a rating system for the buildings so that people know, oh, I'm moving into a building that's only rated a C in terms of its seismic performance. Much the way that California, for example, rates restaurants. You have a card in every front window of a restaurant, A, B, C, or D. And in terms of the health quality, similar sort of concept of rating seismic performance. And then eventually requiring and making it mandatory retrofits. It's obviously a multi-year project, and it depends starting with things like private schools, assisted living facilities, then apartment buildings, and then gradually getting down to single-family residence units. And it's basically a push. It's called the CAPS Initiative, Community Action Plan for Seismic Safety, to bring the city of San Francisco up as part of the Resilient SF project that I work with the city and Harvard does, to truly make San Francisco a resilient city for what is known to be a future real disaster. Obviously, raising homes, building codes to raise homes or to make homes that are floodable. This is in Tsunami elevated in Constitución. So in addition to the tsunami mitigation park, the retreat, and then also building up elevated as well. So again, that multi-layers of resilience, creating resilience through multiple layers. This is actually a project that we're working on in Broadmoor with the U.S. Green Building Council, and we're building homes that are raised in these are the Brad Pitt homes, the Make It Right Foundation, being built in the lower Ninth Ward. They're actually cradle-to-cradle homes, as well as in all permeable surfaces, et cetera, below. It's really interesting project. What we find is there's a lot of innovation that happens after an event. If you go into now in New Orleans, unfortunately, there's been a failure to actually do this across the board. There was an opportunity to raise almost all the homes, and now only about 15% of the homes will have been raised since Katrina. Many are just built the way they were and are not mitigated from even rainfall events, let alone another levee breach. What's interesting is at the same time, the technology, so now the cost of elevating a building in New Orleans are down to, they only add a very, few percentage points, maybe 3% to the building costs of a building, just because the technology, et cetera, has really been innovated there. Unfortunately, and this again, failure of policy, a lot of our problems with failure to mitigate, failure to adapt is around policy. So these are the base flood elevations for New Orleans. So for Lakeview, you can see yellow is sea level. Red is the base flood elevation line, the level to which the home has to be raised if you're going to do either new construction or major reconstruction, more than 50% construction to a home. And of course, the blue wavy line is actually what Katrina did. And similarly, you can see the lower Ninth Ward. This is fairly criminal that this is the Katrina line, and basically no elevation has to be done there, 1 foot. And then New Orleans East has to go higher, but still not quite high enough, and the cost to add an extra few feet would have been very, very minimal to that. Yet these are, and it turns out that most of these decisions in New Orleans as setting of the base flood elevations were basically a political compromise. So it was politics trumped safety and security and science as to what it actually should have been. The third area is using flexible design, adaptive design. This is Millennium Park in Chicago, and this is actually what the cartoon about what the base flood elevations or the plan for FEMA should have been, which is basically build all the homes on arcs. But one of the things, there is a lot of progress going on in floating homes and new approaches to really out-of-the-box flexible design approaches to the way. We as a world, we as a nation and we as a world are actually going to have to really start to think much harder about true innovative and flexible approaches. These are not just pie-in-the-sky things. These are real homes for commercial things. These are all in the Netherlands. This is an apartment complex in Amsterdam or Rotterdam. The other concept is the use of floodable spaces, of figuring out how to live with water, of instead of fighting water and trying to constrain water, is to live with water. The concept of having areas that can be flooded and can then resume back to their non-flooded state without much damage. Some of this is in terms of the design of the thing. Some of it is about the vegetation that's used so that you have water resistant and water tolerant plants and vegetation. So this, for example, is designed for a canal. The top is sort of the existing canal in New Orleans, and the bottom it's actually a larger canal, but then also with green space for overflow, so that you actually have in times of flooding, a giant canal between those two levees that have been pushed back. But in the meantime, you actually have some great park and green space that did not exist prior to, and that's part of a lot of the theory here is to use and make these livable and recreation spaces. This is in Spain. It's the same exact concept that we just showed, where basically you've got park and water area, but this entire basin can be filled with water in the event of flooding. The other is how you actually do water retention within urban places, and there's a lot of focus going into to this of how we can actually redesign our urban environment to basically store and retain and manage water. This is the floating garden example. This is a bayou, Buffalo Bayou in Buffalo, New York, basically taking space that was underutilized concrete space under the thing, making both an attractive place but also dealing with water. This is Seoul, South Korea, of water gardens, and using the concept of that. This is the concept of using, this is actually being used very heavily in Portland, Oregon, of using basically swales around the sidewalks, as well as permeable surfaces, permeable asphalt and permeable sidewalks for managing water. This is a plan. It will not happen in New Orleans for a lot of political reasons, but is something that came out of the Dutch dialogues, which is a set of really fascinating dialogues between the Netherlands, sponsored by the government there, as well as some universities and design firms there, as well as the academics and design community an urban planning community in New Orleans, to talk about solutions. But there's basically, this is City Park, which is now just green, just plain green space, and to basically think about urban water parks as a solution for storing and managing water. And this is another thing that came out of that as well, which is New Orleans has a high percent of blighted properties, like many cities in urban, sort of decaying urban cities. And one of the concepts is to basically take the blighted properties and turn them into to bioswales, et cetera, to capture water is a way to both tackle the blight problem as well as the issues in terms of the environment. This is, I mentioned the Dutch dialogues. This is a chart from the Dutch dialogues, that basically shows that Louisiana is not the Netherlands. Louisiana actually has more average rainfall, has more peak rainfall, has more peak wind speeds, has more peak storm occurrence, has higher storm surges, bigger levees as well. But the major difference between the Netherlands and Louisiana is that Louisiana only has currently only one layer of defense, of protection versus of resilience, which, as we've seen, can be very fragile and therefore very catastrophic versus the Netherlands. So the conclusion out of all of this is the concept of layering of resiliency, that there's no one thing or panacea that creates resiliency, but it is a set of many aspects that come together to create a very rich texture of resilience of communities. Thank you.
Take a few moments to take questions before we head over to the University Club for our wild disco ball experience. So, if anyone has something.
Yeah, how would this maybe relate to some of the effects of climate change? I mean, is it the same as far as flooding goes and water management?
So the principles are all the same in terms of we're going to what climate change really does is it speeds up the time frame by which and makes us have to deal with some of these issues. It certainly makes it certainly makes it tougher in many regards. We will have to do so. Things like thinking about managed retreat is going to have to be part of, in certain areas in the world, we're already starting to have to deal with it. So it's, and we will have to do that. We are going to have to really work on hardening of some of the physical assets as sea level rises and storms intensify and create larger storm surges. And we're going to have to think about, we're really going to have to redo our building codes. A lot of what's really interesting is that the insurance industry is probably going to be the largest driver of forcing the world to change its building codes, as well as force retreat out of areas. That some of this may not be, policy decisions made by governments, but some of this may be economic decisions that are made by things like insurance companies and the ability to get insurance, and therefore also the financial institutions and their, unwillingness to underwrite mortgages or do commercial loans for building developments in risky places. So I think we're going to see a lot of movement that way, both in terms of retreat, but also in terms of making sure that, okay, if you are going to build in a risk area, that it is built in a way that it's not going to be destroyed or damaged. And I think we're going to really start seeing the insurance industry play a much more vocal role in forcing that. I think we're also going to start to see a lot of areas, and I didn't really talk about this, sort of falls under that, some of those other categories of mitigation, but I think we're going to find that risk actually starts getting priced more and more into things. Right now we basically subsidize risk, and there's going to be less and less tolerance for subsidizing risk and pricing risk into the market. So a great example is National Flood Insurance Program subsidizes flood insurance for people who are not, it is not if we actually had to really pay what it costs to insure in a flood zone, it might change the way people think about either where they build or how they build in those areas. So I think climate change basically just accelerates the trend for us and complicates, and then there's all kinds of other add-on issues that climate change brings in terms of drought, in terms of all kinds of issues. I mean, the list goes on and on with that, which I didn't even touch on here.
What kind of policies and financing mechanisms do they have in place in New Zealand where you can actually move people out of some of these areas that obviously weren't in place in New Orleans?
Yeah. So it's actually, what's fairly fascinating is the fact that the New Zealand government is obviously not as it has far less revenues and money to work with than the U.S. did. And in terms of disaster size-wise, they're actually roughly comparable in terms of the amount of damage. New Zealand's actually spending less on recovery. We spent 12, well, in Louisiana alone, we spent about almost $13 billion on rebuilding of homes, uninsured losses, plus we had insured losses. About $40 billion in insured losses. We just chose to rebuild in places that probably should never have been built in before, as opposed to using that money to buy people out and move them out, which is ultimately was a political decision as opposed to a financial decision. I would say the big difference is that the New Zealand government made a very bold political decision. It takes a lot as a political leader to decide to tell, this case, 6,500 people. Plus, they actually had to tell the entire community that they were going to do it before they could actually tell people which ones were. So they basically had to tell 40,000 people that they might be moved. So it was a major political thing, and I would say there are very few cases where that actually happens. There's been some of that in Indonesia. China has done that after the earthquakes, the Wenchuan earthquakes, and moved villages and things. But that takes a sort of a political will that I'm not sure that certainly didn't exist in Louisiana, and I'm not sure it would exist for other things here in the U.S. I do think over time there's going to be more and more recognition of the fact that that's going to have to be part of the solution.
I understand that meteorology is far from perfect science. We know that for everybody, obviously, but in terms of prevention, when a storm's maybe a day or two out, or maybe 12 hours out, what potential for progress in the imminent danger protocols do you see in terms of the way we, hours out from the storm, manage it, or what potential stopgap procedures can we improve upon?
In terms of things like evacuation or preparedness for response, or
simply evacuation, but maybe in terms of mobile structures that can be used, or perhaps houses that have channels built into them that can be open and cleared so that storm waters can move through them instead of abutting against the house or something like that.
Well, all of those are true. One of the things that it is very, and I didn't mention this, but it is very or I kind of made a little reference to sort of floodable houses, and some of that is about elevating houses so that the water can pass through and not using that space beneath for anything, and having the openings. And there are actually a lot of guidelines. We know exactly how the dynamics of how water works, both in terms of storm surges, as well as in terms of tsunami and things. And we do know actually quite well how to build and engineer to be able to do that. And that's the best thing. A lot of it's also about doing things like, the one thing that actually has happened a lot in New Orleans is we've raised all the mechanicals, which was, so at least now you have things saved from flooding if water does come through. There's a lot of ability in terms of materials to use materials and some of them are sort of very simple things, like they're now doing the drywall in New Orleans. So instead of just running in sheets vertically the way it used to, running them at horizontally, so that you can just pull off the bottom layer and redo the first layer. There's a lot of reusing different materials that allow for flooding. Unfortunately, New Orleans, if you go to, for example, Florida has really actually quite good building codes around hurricanes. Homes now, you cannot have a home without hurricane shutters, for example, et cetera. None of that in New Orleans. The building codes in New Orleans did change after Katrina, but it was such a minor change. It was almost nothing. So, and some of that was concern over the cost of what it would do, that they wanted to be able to rebuild. And if you put all these regulations onto how you can rebuild, people may not have had the money to rebuild, so you got into that sort of dilemma. But also in New Orleans, interestingly enough, the historic lobby was quite opposed to, and the changes to do things like hurricane shutters or stuff like that. But across the board, I'm a huge advocate of strengthening our building codes and really designing to live with these things. We were talking earlier that in New Orleans, the homes built prior to World War II were built as raised basement homes, where the first floor was just storage and had openings so water could pass through, which is part of it. You have to have those openings so water can come through. And because flooding was a relatively regular occurrence in New Orleans, so people just built that way. And after World War II, especially as the levees came in and were built, we moved to brick on slab construction. And to build brick on slab on grade in New Orleans at below sea level is crazy. But we did it basically thinking that the levee protection was enough. But there are many wonderful engineering and design solutions to a lot of these problems.
Do you know of any cities or states that have essentially decided not to rebuild public infrastructure as a way to force retreat? So that to the extent when the actual government have built roads or developed utilities that service barrier islands or coastal seashores, just refuse to rebuild it?
Yeah. I don't know of any that have done it. There have been a few cases where, I don't know, I have examples off the top of my head, where it sort of kind of happened that way, but it was more sort of agreement among everyone, sort of back off, but as a way to actually force people out. Although I do say in New Orleans it actually was talked about, but then, and it has not been tested in the courts, but there was fear that actually would be that if you cut off services, would that basically amount to takings or eminent domain and which would obviously run into a little problem because the Constitution. that has not been tested, and there are actually a lot of people who would actually like to test it as a strategy. I don't know anyone else. Well, I actually have to say in New Zealand, so I sort of presented it as compulsory buyout, but actually it's a voluntary buyout in Christchurch. However, it's a voluntary buyout with we are not actually going to rebuild the infrastructure in the area. So it's it's voluntary with you're on your own if you want to live here on in terms of you're not going to get water, power, sewer, electric.
So there was a voluntary buyout. Are there areas that are doing a forced retreat? And if so, how you must get some pushback from people in the community, I imagine, to deal with people building on the coast all the time. They love their property and they don't care. They'll go back and rebuild.
Yeah. What's interesting, there are not a lot of mandatory buyouts that have been done or takings that have been done in this area. I think we're going to see a lot more. I mentioned China. China actually does it all the time. It's part of the. Indonesia did some. Chile is doing some. I was actually talking to some folks earlier. Chile, and actually Constitucion, that region there, it's where the Tsunami Park is going, in that red air zone beyond it where they're not doing. It's 185 homes, and Chile, the Chilean government is a very central government. It's very weak local government and very strong central government. So it actually has the both ability and the history of just making unilateral decisions. They're actually, from those 185 residents, finding tremendous pushback, and it's causing the government lots of problems and issues. In fact, I was down talking to some of the residents that they were going to die on their property, and exactly. So what's interesting is it does tend to be, we do see that as a sort of universal. New Orleans actually talked about doing the shrinking the city. Originally, they sort of identified areas with a map of green areas, mostly the low areas. It was actually sort of a combination of areas that were low that probably either should not have been built on in the first place. Also would make good water retention areas for future flooding. And were also a combination of areas that had very low insurance rates, so it was questionable whether they could come back. That got fought off in a very ugly local politics sort of way, and then sort of it next became sort of only maybe perhaps abandon everything east of the Industrial Canal, which is New Orleans east and the Lower Ninth Ward, and eventually that got fought off as well as a political thing. It becomes the politics of forced takings of property become very difficult for any political leader to stomach that sort of thing. I give huge credit to the folks in Christchurch for doing that. Takes a lot of guts to tell people that you're going to take their homes. There have been some incidents where it's been done on 50 homes or 30 homes here in the U.S. in various areas, and which especially around river flooding and things like that, and actually Cedar Rapids, there's some sections there, but it's much smaller scale and than the kinds of things we're talking about here. Sorry.
Was there any mandatory performance bonding by any chance in New Zealand? So sort of requiring those people who are supposed to stay in these high-risk areas to basically underwrite their own
Well,
risk?
yes. So in New Zealand, it's actually a great point. Actually, so yes and no. So basically what they did was say you're on your own with risk. So but they did not require them to do bonding or anything on their own, or to find, if they could, but they couldn't, insurance for those properties. Including no one, especially when you cut off services, no one's going to even underwrite you for things like fire insurance or other things. While they didn't force them to actually take on and fund their own risk, they basically said you're on your own in terms of risk for the future. Although it turns out, it looks like maybe out of 6,500, maybe 100 will stay. I mean, it's just because there's nothing, there's no reason to stay. There's nothing out there anymore. Businesses are closed and have moved. There's no neighbors, etc. So it's what's interesting there is, of those 6,500, maybe 15-20% of the homes were actually fine. Because damage isn't 100%. It's not always universal. You have a distribution of terms of level of damage. So they actually had to buy. So you might have had a perfect home, move back in after the disaster, and now you're having to move. We saw that a lot in New Orleans, as well as in some of these areas with the green dots. One of them, Broadmoor, that I spent a lot of time working in. The residents there, if you had a home that had been built as a raised basement, you actually came out of the disaster quite well, and all of a sudden now they're talking about bulldozing your home and raising your neighborhood. There's differences too in terms of, it had everything there from brick on slab to most of the building stock, or a lot of it was on piers, anywhere between 18 inches and 36 inches. So you had some variety there. Still not enough for the Katrina line, which was 5 to 8 feet. But also you found differences in performance on 1-story versus 2-story homes and the percent of damage for the total home. So it becomes that sort of difference in damage from people creates those different kinds of resistance. Like, wait a second, I'm fine. Why are you taking my home?
Okay, you're really going to make this one more.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'm thinking of an example in New Jersey. The Bureau of Reclamation was going to build a dam on the Delaware River a long time ago. Never happened. But that land is now national park land. And there are private inholdings. And I believe the National Park Service owns the land, owns those homes, but they are given a 99-year lease or a lifetime lease or something like that. And they're literally inspected by the Park Service too. This is our house. We're going to see that you're maintaining it or whatever. But is that some sort of compromise kind of thing?
Yes, and so I actually happen to live in a house in San Francisco that is owned by the National Park Service in Fort Mason. So I have park rangers who cut my lawn. It's a really strange thing. But a great example of that is actually along the Mississippi River in several floodplains along up and down the Mississippi River, that we have several places, and they were activated this spring, where we opened the spillways to divert water out of the Mississippi River because it was getting too high. And many of the homes, while they weren't owned by the federal government owned an easement on the properties to be able to flood the properties and which were actually buyouts that had been done after the 1927 floods a long time ago. And they basically went to the property owners and said, we're going to, we're making this a floodplain where we're going to put in a spillway, and it's going to, we're going to flood your property, and we're taking your property. We're going to compensate you for it. But we'll let you live in it. But we have the right to flood your home anytime we want. It caused a lot of, concern in some newspaper articles, but overall, it's actually not. It's actually a very good strategy, and it worked. I mean, it saved a lot of loss of and suffering for other properties as well.
All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.